Elias walked down the narrow cobblestone street, his breath visible in the cold night air. Shadows danced on the worn-down houses and shops, like sinister figures waiting to pounce. Every lamppost seemed to flicker, casting fleeting pools of light that barely cut through the darkness. He quickened his pace, trying to shake off the chill that crept up his spine with every step. The wind howled through the alleyways, carrying whispers of distant voices and the occasional, unsettling skitter of movement. Elias's heart raced. Every footfall seemed too loud in the hushed night. This part of town was known for its danger, but there was no turning back now. Elias froze as he thought he saw a dark figure moving behind him. Shadows seemed to stretch and curl around the edges of the street, making the figure appear more monstrous with every step closer it took. He turned, but the figure remained hidden under a tattered cloak. Long, hairy arms swayed slightly, ending in sharp claws that glinted menacingly in the dim light. The creature's eyes, wild, gold, and hungry, watched him with a strange, predatory intensity. Elias swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat as he realized the figure was no mere shadow. It was something far more sinister. Elias grinned, revealing sharp, glistening fangs that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. The darkness seemed to ripple around him as his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. He could feel the creature's shock as it stepped back, clearly unprepared for what it was facing. Elias had been hiding his true nature for too long, but now the mask slipped away completely. His mouth opened wider than any humans should ever go, exposing a second row of razor-sharp fangs that glistened like ivory in the moonlight. Drool dripped slowly from his lips, a reminder of his predatory nature. The creature gaped, unable to comprehend the transformation. Elias was no longer just a frightened boy. He was a monstrous hybrid, a fusion of man and beast. The creature's eyes, once wild and hungry, now seemed perplexed. The realization seemed to dawn on it slowly. This wasn't just a random victim Elias had encountered. There was something deliberate, something calculated about how he had chosen this moment to reveal his true form. The creature took a step back, trying to regain its composure, but it was too late. Elias was in control now. The creature's fear was palpable, a visceral reaction to the transformation it was witnessing. Elias's grin grew wider, more predatory, as he watched the creature's struggle. The words escaped his lips almost monotonously, his voice tinged with a low, rumbling growl. Elias had tasted fear before, but this was different. He was now the predator, and the creature was his prey. The creature's breath hitched as it stepped back again, realizing it was no longer the one in control. Elias's fangs gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting his own madness. He chuckled softly, a low, menacing sound that seemed to come from deep within him. The creature reached into its cloak, revealing a rusted blade that it dragged across the wall, leaving a deep, menacing mark. The sound was harsh against the silence, sending shivers down Elias's spine. "Blood," the creature hissed in a hoarse whisper. Its voice was thick with malice, echoing through the narrow street like a death knell. Elias's grin grew even wider, showing his own set of sharpened teeth, so long and pointed they seemed unnatural. He reached up, wiping the blood from his cheek with a gloved hand, then licked it off slowly, savoring the taste. The creature's question hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. Elias tilted his head slightly, studying the creature with amusement. "Blood," he repeated in a whisper that seemed to reverberate through the night. "Blood, blood." The chant seemed to grow louder with every syllable, as if the darkness around him was feeding on the creature's terror. Elias's laughter was low and rich, filling the air like a dark, disturbing lullaby. The creature, trembling now, took a step back, but it was too late. Elias was no longer just a boy. He was something far more sinister, something that reveled in fear and darkness. The creature's expression was a mixture of fear and confusion, as it struggled to understand the change that had occurred in Elias. Elias's grin didn't waver. It grew more manic, more inhuman. "I'm going to have so much fun with you," the creature croaked, its voice barely a whisper. The blade was still clenched tightly in its hand, but Elias wasn't afraid. He had tasted power now, and it was intoxicating. The creature's grip on the knife tightened, But Elias wasn't interested in fighting. He had something far more insidious planned. A slow, terrifying unraveling of the creature's sanity. Elias's eyes darted to the creature's knife, then back to the creature's face. "Do you want me to show you a magic trick?" he asked softly, his voice dripping with sarcasm and a hint of amusement. The creature was paralyzed, unable to move, a deer caught in headlights. Elias's grin widened further, showing his fangs even more clearly. He took a step closer, his mouth opening wider, exposing that second row of fangs that were now fully visible. Drool pooled at the corners of his mouth as he inched closer to the creature. The smell of blood thick in the air. The creature's eyes were wide with terror, fixed on Elias as he approached slowly but with certainty. Elias's mouth opened impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth should ever be, revealing those razor-sharp fangs that seemed to glisten in the moonlight like ivory. The creature couldn't move, couldn't speak. Its fear was absolute. Elias's lips curled back into a manic grin as he got closer, savoring the terror he was eliciting from the creature. This was no longer a mere encounter. It was a transformation, a nightmare come to life, and Elias was the architect of it all. The tension between Elias and the cloaked figure hung heavy in the air. The beastly man, once predatory and assured, now stood frozen in place, his trembling hands clutching the rusted blade. He dared not attack, yet he couldn't run. Not with Elias's piercing, glowing eyes locking him in place. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind and the uneven breathing of the cloaked stranger. The creature was at a loss, caught between instinct and sheer terror, and Elias could sense it. He grinned wider, revealing rows of deadly fangs, savoring the moment. The call was sharp, commanding. It echoed through the still night, cutting through the tension like a blade. Both Elias and the cloaked man turned toward the source of the interruption. Emerging from the darkness, a young girl approached, her steps deliberate, her expression unamused. She was clad in a flowing white nightgown, its ethereal fabric swaying gently in the breeze, giving her an almost ghostly appearance under the pale moonlight. Her long blonde hair framed a face that was stern, her glowing eyes identical to Elias's. Her arms were crossed and her scowl was unmistakable. The girl's lips tightened into a thin line as she stopped a few paces away, glaring at him. Elias chuckled softly, flicking the pocket watch chain with a flourish. The siblings exchanged a brief glance, a silent battle of wills that only they could understand. The cloaked man stood motionless, his wide eyes darting between the two, unsure of what to make of this bizarre encounter. He took a cautious step back, hoping to slip away unnoticed, but the girl's sharp eyes caught him immediately. The man froze in place, his breath hitching as her glowing gaze locked onto him. Her expression softened into a cruel, almost playful smile. As she turned back to Elias, she raised an eyebrow, stepping closer to inspect the man. Her eyes trailed over his trembling form, noting the sweat glistening on his forehead, the slight quiver in his hands. He looked pitiful, like a rat cornered by a pair of hungry cats. The man whimpered softly, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of his terror. He glanced between the siblings, their identical glowing eyes, their sharp grins. He opened his mouth to plead, but no words came out, only a faint strangled sound that barely escaped his throat. The girl smirked, her fangs glinting faintly as she stepped closer to the man. He stumbled back, his back pressing against the cold brick wall, nowhere left to run. His wide, tear-filled eyes pleaded silently for mercy, but there was none to be found in the glowing gazes of the siblings. Elias stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, almost savoring the anticipation. The man pressed himself further against the wall, his trembling hands raising the rusted blade as a feeble attempt at defense. Elias chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing with amusement. The man's breaths came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he struggled to summon the courage to strike. But before he could, Elias moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to follow. In an instant, the blade was knocked from the man's hand, clattering to the ground. Elias's hand gripped the man's throat, pinning him to the wall with ease. The man let out a choked sob, his body shaking as Elias leaned in closer. His fangs glistened in the dim light. droplets of saliva falling from his lips. The girl watched from a few steps away, her arms crossed, her expression one of mild amusement. Elias smirked, his grip tightening slightly. The man whimpered again, his eyes squeezing shut as Elias leaned in further. The night seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening as the siblings closed in on their prey. The girl stepped closer, her fangs bared now, her hunger evident in her glowing eyes. The two lunged in unison, their sharp teeth sinking into the man's flesh. His scream tore through the night, a blood-curdling sound of pure anguish and despair. But the siblings paid it no mind. They fed, their movements almost animalistic, their hunger driving them as they drained the life from their victim. In the distance, a figure watched silently. Grim, the Reaper of Souls, stood cloaked in shadow, his onyx eyes glinting in the moonlight. He made no move to intervene, his expression stoic as he observed the horrifying scene. His trench coat swayed in the breeze, concealing the massive coal-black wings that rested beneath. He adjusted the sack slung over his shoulder, the wails of the damned echoing faintly from within. With that, Grim turned and walked away, his form blending into the shadows as the siblings finished their feast. The man's screams faded into silence, leaving only the faint whistle of the wind and the occasional drip of blood onto the cobblestone street. The night carried on, cold and indifferent, as if nothing had happened at all. The siblings stepped back from their prey, their lips stained crimson and their eyes glowing with satisfaction. Elias wiped his mouth with the back of his gloved hand, a smug grin spreading across his face. Beside him, his sister tilted her head, inspecting the limp body with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She rolled her glowing eyes, stepping over the body with a graceful stride. Her white nightgown trailed behind her, the hem soaked with fresh blood. The pair began walking away from the scene, their movements unhurried and deliberate. Behind them, the lifeless form of the cloaked man lay forgotten, just another victim claimed by the night. The cobblestone streets stretched out ahead, illuminated by the dim glow of flickering lampposts above. The stars shone faintly, their light barely piercing through the oppressive darkness. The air was heavy, filled with the faint scent of blood and decay, but neither sibling seemed to mind. From the shadows, a faint, eerie whistle emerged. Both siblings paused, their heads turning sharply toward the sound. Elias's playful grin faltered slightly, and his sister's brows furrowed in confusion. The whistle grew louder, closer, carrying a haunting melody that sent a chill through the air. A shadowy figure emerged, its trench coat billowing around it. Grim, the Reaper, watched the siblings with his cold onyx eyes, his expression unreadable. The siblings exchanged a glance, their smiles returning, though their eyes glimmered with something akin to recognition, and perhaps fear. They bowed their heads in mocking deference before disappearing into the shadows, leaving Grim to his solemn task.